Hello and welcome to the More Than a Church podcast, replay audience type replay. I am your host, Zach Breckenridge. Thank you for coming back if you are joining us again. And let me know where you're watching from. If you're new, welcome. If you have not already, please like, subscribe, turn on those notifications both on Facebook and YouTube. And if you're watching live, if you're watching on the replay, go ahead and share this, tag somebody in the comments that needs to hear this teaching. This is going to be a really powerful one, and it's really going to shift our perspective on this subject matter of the pastoral ministry in the modern church. When you're sharing, please use the hashtag more than a church. We're live Facebook and YouTube here at noon. I've been enjoying this. This is our third week now at noon. We're talking about some fire discussion topic today. It's going to be amazing. If you're on Facebook, throw some praying hands in the comments. If you are on YouTube, drop a fire emoji. Today, we're on episode 18, our third part in this series. We're in the middle of our first podcast series, episode 18. We're talking about today, are pastors biblical? So we are in a 5-part series on the fivefold ministers, on the fivefold ministry. These are the offices of leadership that Christ himself gave or gifted to his church. These are the positions of leadership that are ordained by Jesus to lead his church. So we've talked about in episode 16 and 17, apostles and prophets. Today, are pastors biblical? Are pastors biblical? All right, so we know that pastoral care is a biblical concept. Really, what I want us to get into today is the term pastor the most accurate term to convey what we think that office should be? Is the term pastor the most accurate term for us to use for that office? Excuse me. In regards to modern context. So we're going to look at Ephesians 4:11. That's the basis of fivefold ministry in just a moment. And EA Hubs in the house. I see y'all on both Facebook and YouTube. That's awesome. Let me know where you're watching from. Are you at work right now? Or are you at the house? What's going on in your world, in your life? We're talking about, are pastors biblical? Really, the better question to ask is the term pastor the best term for us to use in regards to what we're discussing of the 5 offices of leadership? Is our role of pastor the one, and our context, our semantics for this term pastor, is that the term that Jesus meant whenever he was inspiring this, when Holy Spirit was inspiring it? All right, I'm going to pull up our share screen. Let me go ahead and pull over Ephesians 4:11. It says, and he, we know the context of this is Jesus. The Apostle Paul is writing this to church at Ephesus. He's talking about Christ in the paragraph before. So the context leading into this is, and Jesus gave, that's our understanding, he gifted the church. These are the gifts of Christ Jesus. He gave the church, and he gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry. And it continues on there. Now, I'm doing these a little bit out of order from how they're listed there in that verse, but I felt like it was important for us to talk about pastors and the pastoral ministry before we go into the offices of evangelist and teacher. It's important for us to have an understanding of this. So let me pull this up big screen for those of you who aren't just listening to it. You have time to kind of look at the screen. There is a superscript note there on this term shepherds. There's a number 3 there. I'll pull it up. Number 3, it says, or pastors. So that's a footnote there in the ESV translation. And then there is also a footnote next to the term teachers. And it says the ESV translators want us to know that that could be translated as shepherd teachers. So that's an important thing for us to kind of keep in mind. And we'll understand more about that as we look into the office of the teacher. That's part of the reason that I wanted us to look at pastors, shepherds first, is because we have this possible translated term of shepherd teacher. So we have to understand what is a pastor, what is a shepherd before we can really even understand teachers. All right. So as I read that, Ephesians 4:11, it listed the fivefold offices as apostle, prophet, shepherd, teacher, evangelist. Or apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, teachers. There we go. I'm going to do evangelist probably last, but why does the ESV translate that term as shepherd as opposed to our normal cultural contemporary language of pastor? Why this translation is the main translation that translates this term, this Greek term. We're going to look at it in a few moments, but translates this Greek term as shepherd as opposed to pastor. Now, the ESV, the English Standard Version, is the one that I preach from every Sunday. It's my main passage that I use to preach from. I study from various translations, but the ESV is a very accurate word-for-word translation style of translation. It also is very easy to read. So why did this translation that's so accurate in the word for word, why did it choose a different word besides what's typically conveyed through our contemporary audience? Typically, we're more familiar with pastor. Why did they remove this term pastor and replace it with the term shepherd in this verse? It's very accurate to the original language. Why did they remove the term pastor from the whole New Testament? I want you to see this with me. So we're going to pull back up the ESV. Let me get the footnotes closed down, and I'll make it a little bit larger. Let me go into the search bar. If you search the term pastor in the ESV, look at how many verses it pulls up. None. Not a single not a single verse with the word pastor in that entire translation. Why? According to the ESV, the term pastor, not just in this verse, but the term pastor is nowhere in the Bible according to the ESV translation. Now, I believe this is in part to connect this concept as a prophetic image to God and to the nature of God found within this office. What are the aspects or elements of the nature of God, the character of God, that this office is responsible for, either not necessarily recreating, but for sharing to the body of Christ? What is this office responsible for? So I believe in part it's for us to connect this prophetic imagery better to the nature of God and being a shepherd. Now, if you're with me in the chat, finish this next verse with me. Psalm 23, the Lord is my blank, I shall not want. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. So I believe that in part, it may be to give us greater context, greater contextualization as to the nature of this office. Good. I'm seeing all sorts of comments coming through. Taryn, Wade, Bradley, and Wendy. Shepherd, the Lord is my shepherd. So I believe in part it's for us to have a greater context as to the nature of this office. However, from the scholarly perspective, there's more that's going on here. There is more that's going on than they just chose to translate this in a way for us to get a better image of what's going on. There is more to the absence of the term pastor in the Bible, especially in this translation. So I'm going to flip over now to Logos. If you'll give me just a couple of moments, I'll pull it up on the share screen with us for you to see. Now, listen, I've got the title page pulled up, so I'm going to say this, then I'll come back and revisit it. The ESV was originally translated in 2001. That's when the first copyright is on the ESV from Crossway Bibles. All right. Let me go down now to Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11. I want us to look at this term shepherd in the Greek so we can see what's actually going on, what's being communicated. Why do most translations translate this as the earlier translations did? like the King James, Geneva Bible. Why did they choose this term shepherd? And why do some more modern translations, the ESV being the most predominant, why did they translate it differently than shepherd, or differently than pastor, excuse me? Why do they translate it now as shepherd? So I want us to go into this original language and see what's going on. Let me close this out because I did it, but I want to do it where you can see. Okay, so I've highlighted this term shepherd. I'm going to scroll over here and do a Bible word study on that term. The term shepherd is defined in the original language. The meaning in the original language is shepherd or herdsman. Now, there is this other context from another resource that gives us the context of minister. So we can see all these other different things. There is only one that, or excuse me, there's another one down here at the very bottom that has the term pastor. But as we're looking at this, we see shepherd, herdsman, shepherd minister, shepherd leader, ruler, shepherd of flocks, his friend, a captain. Now, this is really important, that term captain. I'm going to actually go off of my notes for just a moment. Because if you will recall from our study on the apostolic, the apostle is a captain of captains. So when Jesus gave these two offices to the church, the shepherd is the captain of the flock, the apostle is the captain of the captains. So as Jesus gave these two terms, apostle and shepherd, the shepherd was always intended by Jesus to be covered by an apostle. A shepherd is an overseer of the flock. The apostle is the overseer of the overseers. So as we see, the way the ESV translates this is actually very consistent. It translates it every single time the same way. Let me go back and show you that. But not only do they translate it the same way every time, see right here, it's translated as shepherd or shepherds every single time that it's found in, that Greek word is found throughout the Bible, New or Old Testament, or excuse me, New Testament in the Greek. Every time it's found in the New Testament, the ESV translates it the same way, shepherd, so they don't have to use different words to try to fit the narrative. They use the term shepherd every single time, so it's used very consistently for every time in every rendition. Also, the term shepherd is the most accurate translation based on the definition of that term. So this term, if we look at it a little bit further, and I won't go too much into it. Let me see if I can pull it up this way. There we go. Most of the time, and I know it's going to be difficult to read that, it's smaller font, but this term shepherd is typically, let me say it this way, it is utilized most often in the parabolic speech of Jesus. So if you look at those verses that utilize this term shepherd, most of the time it's being utilized by Jesus in some sort of parabolic speech. And Jesus utilizes this term shepherd, how he, being God, guides those who are following him, and how he desires to guide them into the plans and promises of God. Good afternoon, Renee, Donna, thank you so much. I definitely feel like it's a grace that God's given me to explain this. Hope y'all are all having a blessed day. All right, so we're talking about this term pastor. We're talking about the term shepherd. Most translations translate it because of this mindset. Most translations, unless it's absolutely necessary, they won't translate a word differently. They'll go back and default to what the eldest translations have translated that in that language. So for the English language, most of the time we default back to the King James or at times the Geneva Bible. So that's kind of the standard of translation. But the ESV has done something that they thought was necessary in that they translate this term shepherd actually as what it is. They translated the term shepherd as opposed to pastor. So that leads me to my next thought or my next question, because that term was utilized for so long. What is a pastor? What is a pastor? Help me out in the chat, because I've been called one for over a decade, and I truly don't know. There's actually not a biblical definition for pastor. And when you ask, depending on what circle or stream or denomination you're in, it seems like most have a very vast definition of what this term pastor consists of. When we look at the other offices of the fivefold ministry, apostle, the term apostle was chosen by Jesus out of secular culture of his time. It has a secular image of what that office is responsible for and looks like. I just mentioned an apostle is a captain of captains. Prophet, the term prophet has an old covenant image of what that office looks like, and then also is given new covenant parameters for which it operates within. Teacher, that term seems pretty obvious, right? We can gather from cultural context, though this office maybe in our modern cultures has been diluted because of how prevalent it is in secular culture. But teacher, we can understand the responsibility of a teacher pretty adequately without going too in depth into it because of society. The term evangelist, it's derived from this term, the term that we translate gospels, the Greek term evangelion, and evangelist simply means one who brings the good news. They're the good news bringer. What is a pastor? What is a pastor? All right, I'm seeing a couple different comments. Donna says, a person who helps teach you, but will correct you and love you, but not say yes to make you happy. Carter says it's a senior leader's title from streams that have no language and understanding for fivefold. All right. So great answers, great thoughts. If anybody else has a thought on what a pastor is, throw it in the comments. We're going to talk about some of the issues. Carter adds, this is a big one, he's supposed to do everything. Rather than when he said they feed the flock. So this term pastor is a very complex term in modern society. What is a pastor? We've talked about the other four offices very generically for this episode, but we can understand pretty quickly when we hear the term teacher, you hear the term prophet, you hear the term apostle, you hear the term evangelist. There's a pretty simplified definition or image that pops in your mind. When you hear the term pastor, it's pretty vague. And the ESV, I mentioned it's a more modern translation. We saw it on the title page. It's translated originally in 2001. I'm about to share with you why, personally, I'm an advocate for modern translation updates. If I were to ask you, let me give you some illustrations before we fully go into this. If I were to ask you back in the 90s, Michael, let me read his before I get into this. A pastor is a general term for a recognized and established leader of any capacity in a congregation. All right, great answers. All right, let me give you this illustration. If I were to ask you back in the 90s, think of it, most of you who are on here right now, if you were alive, Gen Z in the house, but if you were alive, you're a millennial like myself or older, think back to the 90s, early, late 90s. If I would have asked you back in the 90s, what is an apple? Some of you may have known. Most of you would have responded and thought your first thought would have been a fruit. If I were to ask you today, what's Apple? Your first thought is going to be an iPhone or an iPad. The meaning of words, the semantics of words varies and is dependent upon the current culture. The way what words mean today varies, and the semantics of them is different than what it was 5, 10, 50, 100 years ago. So I looked one up for fun. Here's a fun one. Laura said, pastors, they were considered the head of the church. Good thoughts. All right. So this is a fun one. I want you to type in the comments what you think this term means. This is a term that was really popular in, well, I won't say when because I don't want to give it away. I want you to share in the comments, what do you think the term Twitter Lite means? Twitter, Twitter dash light, Light. What do you think that means? Without me giving you any context, what do you believe the term Twitter Lite means? I know it's going to be a little bit delayed, so I'm going to keep going and I'll come back and read the comments. Twitter Lite. So by the way, Twitter Lite has nothing to do with the term Twitter. Twitter was founded in 2006. Twitter Lite is actually a 16th century word. Try saying that 6 times fast. Twitter Lite is a 16th century word for twilight. Twitter Lite. If you said Twitter Lite today, most Gen Z are going to think you came out with a faster, easier update to Twitter that's more user-friendly to use on your phone. Twitter Lite. It's not. It actually is a term for twilight. Here's a more common term. The term awe. Wade said it sounds like a type of drink. It definitely does sound like a type of drink. That was my other thought. The term awe. The term awe in Old English was a term for fear. It was a term for dread. It was a very negative, it had a very negative connotation around it, like awful. Carter said Twitter Lite sounds like a fat-free version of Twitter. The term awe sounds like fear or dread. The term awe in modern times, that's what it meant in the Old English. The term awe in modern times, it can have a negative connotation like awful, but also awesome or awe-inspiring. Those terms are quite positive. So there was this term that originally only had a negative connotation, but throughout the development of culture and how it got utilized throughout culture, it now has a different connotation to it. The term awe now can have a positive connotation to it as well. All right, so last one. Thee, thine, thou, and a whole slew of other words that were found in the King James Version that are now dead and no longer used in modern speech. So perhaps the ESV used a different word because they wanted to avoid copyright infringement. But I don't believe that's why, though, right? Listen, I really geek out on Bible translations. I've worked for multiple Christian retail companies as I was getting started in my marriage and getting started in ministry. I worked for a couple of different Christian retail companies. And my favorite thing to study and then to share with people was about Bible translations. And when you look at why there are so many different Bible translations, it's because every publisher has their own translation so that they have the full copyright to produce that translation of the Bible. However, the ESV, I don't think they translated this term differently from pastor just because of a copyright issue. And the reason that I know that's not truthful and that's not factual is because the ESV's parent translation is the RSV. And the RSV, the Revised Standard Version, they utilize the term pastor, which means the translators of the English Standard Version had every right to translate that the same as the translation that they were updating. Pastor and what that means today. When you think of the term pastor, what that means to today's audience is drastically different than what it meant 400 years ago, 200 years ago, or honestly, 25 years ago. English-speaking audiences, which is predominantly led by Americans, view pastors from the perspective of needing to fulfill every function within the modern church, which is actually, if we want to be transparent, most individuals, their context and ideal of a pastor is much more akin to the functionality of an office of an apostle than that of a shepherd. The role of a shepherd was being killed out by the demands of the people. But the largest issue is that the people demanded these pastors or shepherds to fill the office of a shepherd, yet function like an apostle, which is something that God has not graced them to do. And that has led to huge amounts of burnout and early exiting of ministry from the American church. Sorry, y'all. Whenever I began and surrendered to ministry, the average tenure of a pastor at a church, at least within the confines or context of the denomination I was serving in, but I'm pretty sure it was wider than that. The average expectancy of a tenure of a pastor was 3 years. 3 years at one church before they moved on. This expectation of a pastor became that the pastor would be the one who would visit the sick and do the weddings and the funerals and do all the preaching. Sunday morning, discipleship classes, Wednesday nights, Sunday evening services, all the special services, 40 plus hours in the office. Outside of that, they're the ones responsible for taking up the offerings and to run all the legal organization of the church, and so on and so on and so on and so on. That is too much for any one man to accomplish well for the body of Christ. It's too great of a burden. And this is why Jesus gave us 5. Yet until we see and understand what the one is responsible for, we fail and we cannot adequately utilize all 5 appropriately. Our perspective has been skewed by time and culture. What that term means in modern times and the expectations on that term, it's unrealistic compared to the context in which it was introduced in the Bible. So translators saw this issue and decided they had to address it. They had to change the way this was translated to translate it in a way that was more accurate to the original definition of the term, but also one that would challenge the cultural context. By the way, their conclusion was this. The translators of the ESV determined that if you are in the apostolic and prophetic camp, you're correct. And that those who were in the pastor camp were wrong. So they changed how we translate this term to challenge our thinking, because they were saying you're looking at this term pastor as though a pastor is the fivefold ministry. So we're removing this out because you got to understand Christ gave 5 offices to the church, not 1. And what you think this one is responsible for is actually the responsibility of the 5. So our modern ideology of a pastor is actually quite unbiblical. Our expectations on this one individual goes well beyond the expectations that the Bible placed upon this office. So to shift the culture of the church back into a biblical and a healthy paradigm, translators of the ESV made this drastic shift in translation. Is this helping anybody out? Let me know in the comments. Is this making sense? I want to share with you. I wrote a book back in 2019 called Hope Line. Listen, let me show you the cover of it real quick, and then I'll read the section on it. So Hope Line, it's an apostolic strategy, accessing your weapons to deliver spiritual warfare from heavenly places. I want to read a section of this book to you that I wrote in regards to shepherds. I'm actually going to read the whole section that I included in here on shepherds. Really what this book talks about is predominantly the office of the apostle and the role of the full fivefold ministry in leading the church in spiritual warfare. Many Christians get beat up, burned out, kicked out, whatever, in spiritual warfare because we try to fight this war as an individual. Wars are not won by individual. They're won by companies, groups, battalions, local churches is how spiritual warfare is won, not just by one individual. But in writing about apostolic spiritual warfare, it was quite necessary for me to include the functions of each of the 5 offices. So I'm going to read very quickly the section on shepherds. Kayla said that's why pastors get burned out. Our apostle was saying this Sunday. Absolutely. The expectations on what that office was entirely too much. All right, let me read this section. It's like 3 pages. There's a lot in here in regards to the fivefold ministry, but I'm going to share everything I have, at least in this section on shepherds. There may be more in here in regards to shepherds, but it's in conjunction to the other offices. This is my entire description, giving it to you for free on the podcast. All right. The title shepherd is found 22 times in the New Testament. And you can go back and see how many, the vast amount of times that apostles and prophets are. I'll probably share some over the next 2 episodes, teachers and evangelists from the book as well. All right. All shepherds are pastors. Not all pastors are shepherds. Somebody needs to write that in the comments. All shepherds are pastors. Not all pastors are shepherds. So we need to open that mindset and mentality. What we view as a pastor, if we go with the current context and culture of what a pastor is, not everyone who's holding the pastoral office is a shepherd, but all shepherds are pastors. I want to make sure I didn't say backwards. So all shepherds are pastors, not all pastors are shepherds. All right, thank you for putting that in there, Michael. The title pastor is not found anywhere in the New Testament according to the ESV. This more modern translation has abandoned the title pastor in part to that statement. It has become widely accepted within our culture that the term pastor is synonymous to the one who's leading a local church. However, that's not always the case. Take, for instance, Timothy. Timothy is told that while he is pastoring, he must do the work of an evangelist. While the Western tradition views Timothy as a pastor who is told not to forget to evangelize, Eastern Orthodox believers have unlocked a vital truth. Timothy at this time was an evangelist who was being instructed by his apostles to not let his current season and position to cause him to not fulfill the call of God on his life to be an evangelist. The church at Ephesus for a season had an evangelist as their pastor, but that didn't make Timothy a shepherd. The term pastor then should be viewed as a title for all ministers when someone simply is unaware of the proper title to crown them with. So, like every month, I have meeting, prayer with the mayor, with the pastors, the leaders in the community. I don't know when I'm being introduced to all of them if they are a shepherd, a teacher, a prophet, an apostle. So the best way to utilize this term in current cultural settings is the term pastor is a term that you would use if you don't know what office someone holds. So it's an appropriate ambiguous title for any leader within the fivefold ministry. That's how our culture has developed this term and what it now means. All right. This could be compared to how Miss was once an acceptable title for any woman until one became aware of their marital status. In our local church, our leadership has the understanding that our culture is not one which widely accepts the fivefold offices as of yet. Once again, I wrote that like 4 years ago. There's been great reformation in this since that time, although we're still working, right? All right. Therefore, within our staff, we are aware of the different offices and functions that each of us hold. We're divinely divided, yet united as one. However, to the church, at the time, we were all pastors. So everyone called us pastor. Now, since then, we've transitioned into utilizing the fivefold language, and we fully became, a couple of weeks ago, NEA Hub. So part of that transition was utilizing the appropriate language, but it took us coming here in this city and for almost 8 years developing the culture and redefining and giving better language, teaching, reteaching, teaching, reteaching, until people understood the correct context for what a pastor is and the necessity of all the fivefold offices. All right. Not all pastors are shepherds at our church. All shepherds, however, are pastors. The biblical title is a unique style of leadership. Shepherds by nature are very focused on the members of the household of God, oftentimes referred to in the Bible as sheep. Shepherds tend to lead from the back. They are very gracious in their leadership style and allow believers to move forward according to their own will while monitoring their direction. Shepherds lead from the rear so that they can monitor the entire flock's movement to ensure that not even one strays from the straight and narrow path. We must encourage shepherds not to be overly empathetic. While they are primarily responsible for feeding the sheep, Jesus also asked Peter to tend the sheep. That's John 21:16. I'm not going to read it for now. To tend a sheep means to protect the sheep. A shepherd must be willing to lay down his spiritual and at times physical life for the well-being of the sheep. Oftentimes, shepherds will be pulled out of the time of isolation with God to minister to a believer. Jesus, help me. To tend the sheep means to discipline the sheep as well. Church government, especially discipline, is one of the most misunderstood aspects of ministry. We must have an equal understanding that shepherds would oftentimes take their staff and break the leg of a sheep that continued to wander and refuse gentle correction. The shepherd would then carry this sheep while the leg healed, teaching the sheep the importance of being close to the heart of the shepherd. All right. So, in a nutshell, as quickly as I can, that's a summary of the office of a shepherd and their purpose. A shepherd's focus is on the earth. It is an earthly focused office. And the office is focused on the care of the sheep, of the people of God. Sheep want to be cared for. They want to be coddled. They want to have their needs met. Now, this is the dangers of congregationally led churches. First off, that's not even a biblical model, but people will always put a shepherd in the position to lead them, but then they will demand other offices out of them that they cannot it's not in their DNA. They cannot physically do that. So the term pastor, I lead a local congregation. By that standard, yes, I am a pastor, but the office that I hold is that of an apostle. Shepherds are very much needed in the church. This tends to be a very polarizing perspective in modern ministries. It tends to have a polarizing effect of the offices in the church. It's like the churches either want heavenly minded offices of apostles and prophets or earthly minded offices, shepherds and evangelists, but we need them both. And so in our church, we have this very well-rounded ministry that functions alongside all of our discipleship processes. We call it care team ministry, and our shepherds in the house, there are associate pastors, if you want to give them a practical title that's familiar within our culture, but they are the senior shepherds of our church, and they oversee this care team ministry and its additional touches with each of the congregants outside of the discipleship process to make sure that they are cared for well. We have to understand that if we're going to teach, preach fivefold ministry, we have to have the full fivefold. So shepherds are needed in the church. Before Peter denies Jesus 3 times, Jesus challenged Peter 3 times to fulfill the function of a shepherd for the early church. Now, I'm going to pull up a longer passage. We're not going to read all of it. But John chapter 10 would be a great chapter for you to study out if you want to learn the most in one chapter about shepherds and the office and what it looks like, how Jesus was a shepherd and how he passed that mantle on through the shepherd mantle in the fivefold ministry. All right, so I can start at verse 1, but I'm going to jump down to verse 7. I'm going to read verses 7 through 18, and I'll touch a couple of highlights and then finish off with one verse before we go into the time of Q&A. All right, beginning with verse 7, it says, "So Jesus again said to them, 'Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved. It will go in and out and find pasture.'" Now, that verse right there will really mess up some people's theology. Let me read it again. "I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved, and he will be able to go in and out and find pasture." All right, I'm not going to preach that, but You can just kind of say law. Think on that for a moment. Verse 10. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. So we can look, we understand the ministry of Jesus. Jesus came to give life and life more abundantly. If something in someone's life is stolen, killed, or destroyed, that is a work of the enemy. It's a work of Satan, not a work of Jesus. Jesus came to give life and life more abundantly. Continuing on, verse 11, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. So this is an exhortation then to those who hold the office of a shepherd. Jesus is the good shepherd, and he's brought in other shepherds, but the difference between someone who is a shepherd to the sheep, who fulfills that office and holds that office, versus someone who is merely there for a paycheck is, do they stand up and confront the wolves, which, by the way, we mentioned this last week. Wolves is the prophetic image of the false prophet. That's the false prophet spirit. They will lay down their life for the sheep. So the difference between someone who holds that office and one who is there for a paycheck is typically seen during times of warfare against the sheep. All right, I got to keep moving on. Verse 13, he flees because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own and my own knows me, just as the Father knows me and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. For this reason, the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own accord. I have the authority to lay it down, and I have the authority to take it up again. This charge I have received from my Father. All right, let me share a little bit on this before I read one final verse. Jesus said he is the good shepherd. He has appointed other shepherds to function like he functions in the office during his absence until he returns. We understand the difference between shepherds who are actually in the office versus ones who are hired hands there just for a paycheck, is whether or not they stick it out in spiritual warfare. Verse 11 talks about a good shepherd. Verse 12, hired hand. Now I want you to listen to verse 16 one more time, and then I'll give you some context on it. Verse 16 says, and I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. At this time, we understand Jesus said, I came only to the lost of the house of Israel. And Jesus sent out his first apostles. He commissioned them only to the house of Israel. Jesus said, though, that there are other sheep of another fold. He's talking about the Gentiles that he is bringing into the same sheepfold, and there will be one fold. This is Jesus explaining what is about to take place through his death, burial, and resurrection, and bringing in the Gentiles into Christianity. There was the fold of the old covenant Judaism. There is Jesus bringing in these new sheep, and there will be one fold Christianity for both the Jews and the Gentiles. So verse 16, this is a reference to the Gentiles. All right, last verse that I want to read before we go into Q&A. So get your questions ready. You can go ahead and start typing them in the comments. It's verse 27. Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. My sheep hear my voice. I know them, and they follow me. Listen, this right here, remember Matthew 7. We talked about it last week. Matthew 7, the context of I never knew you is Jesus responding to the spirit of the wolf, false prophets. If you go back and study that, the context of Jesus saying, away from me, I never knew you, is in context to Jesus speaking and confronting false prophets. Now understand this contextually. Matthew, Jesus help me. John 10, verse 27, the context of that verse, Jesus said, my sheep hear my voice. Remember what Peter said on the day of Pentecost, the confirmation of the prophet Joel, sons and daughters shall prophesy. In order to prophesy, the prerequisite is you have to hear the voice of God. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them. If you hear the voice of God, God knows you, and because you hear his voice and he knows you, the result of that is you now follow him. Hope that's helping somebody out. So Jesus speaks in the earlier paragraph, verse 17 through 18, specifically around verse 16, that there are two sheepfold, one of them that he's the shepherd of, the Jews. And he is going to bring and graft in this new sheepfold, the Gentiles, and there will be one sheepfold of Christianity. Then in the very next paragraph, the following paragraph, verse 27, or a couple of paragraphs later, verse 27, in the context of that, Jesus said, now in this new sheepfold, all of my sheep hear my voice. I know them, and because they hear my voice and I know them, they follow me. Shepherds, if you hold the office of a shepherd, we do not want hired hands. We need shepherds who will feed the sheep, who will tend the sheep, but also who will confront the wolves, the false prophets, and will lay down their life for the sheep. That doesn't have to be physically in laying down for death. What I'm talking about is, and maybe in some extreme situations, it gets to that. Most of the time, what that looks like is shepherds are going to be the office that are inconvenienced late at night, taking those calls and ministering to the people in the moment that they need it. Okay? That's part of the function of that office. This is not about getting rid of pastors. It's about allowing shepherds to function as shepherds, not putting demands on them beyond what they can handle and the capacity of that office. We need all five offices to be all that Christ desires for his church to be. Carter gave me this verse. I'm glad you gave it to me, Carter, because I wanted this verse and I didn't look it up. I failed to look it up beforehand. Jeremiah 3:15 in the ESV says, and I will give you shepherds after my own heart who will feed you with knowledge and understanding, the other shepherds for the other fold, not the hired hands. What is the verse? Actually, I really appreciate you sharing that verse. That wasn't the one I was thinking of. You've shared it with me before. What is the verse that says, and maybe I can look it up too, that you don't get to pick your shepherd? I think the translation says something along the lines like, I have picked a shepherd for you. I think it's 2 Samuel 2:7. Let me know if that's the right one. I'm going to try to look it up. This is like an additional thought. If you have questions, go ahead and put them in the comments. I'm going to start answering them. 2 Samuel, what did I say? 7:8. Let's see if that's the right one. 2 Samuel. I think it's 2 Samuel 7:8. 7:8. Let's see. I'm not seeing it. I don't know if it's how the ESV translate it. Samuel 7:8. Give me just a moment. I'm going to see. I don't know if that's the exact verse. There is a verse. I didn't write it down before. I should have looked it up. But it basically says that God selects your shepherd for you, which Also, once again, it goes back and it confronts this mentality of congregationally led churches and selecting who's on the leadership team. That even in the old covenant, like that wasn't the paradigm. God assigns a shepherd, but also it's important for us to understand in the fivefold ministry, even if your church is led by an apostle, prophet, whatever the combination is, we still need shepherds. There are still shepherds that are assigned to the flock to bring care to the flock. I will look this up and share it while I'm waiting on comments. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, towards the end of it, in the list of spiritual gifts, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, in regards to the implementation, the order of ministerial gifts. So we see the fivefold ministry in Ephesians 4. Listen to how Paul writes it in a different way in the list of spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, the end of it. This is the order of implementation if you're launching a ministry. So 1 Corinthians 12, beginning with verse 27, it says, "Now you are the body of Christ and individually members of it. And God has appointed in the church first apostles," that's the first order of implementation, then second prophets, third teachers, then miracles. That represents the office of evangelist. We'll talk about that. Then gifts of healing. That's representing and speaking to the office of the shepherd, moving in the gift of physical healing, but also a lot of the shepherd's ministry deals with not only physical healing, but also healing of the soul. That's a very pastoral, a very shepherding grace is healing. Okay. Then it continues on and it says, next, helping administration and various kinds of tongues. And then it continues on into the other gifts. Okay. So shepherds are needed. They are very much needed in the modern church, but we have to understand the difference between this generic term pastor, which could be any office really because of our current context, and the true shepherds. And once we understand the true shepherds, then we can receive the true care that the shepherd grace brings to the local church. All right, let me know what comments or questions you have. What questions, what feedback do you have for me? All right. I'm going to scroll up, see if I've missed any questions. I didn't see any as I was sharing, but also I want to make sure that I've not missed any. All right. Any questions regarding pastors, that term, shepherds, that office, or even how that office relates to other offices, maybe even apostles and prophets, because we've already discussed that. Any questions? I really want to find that verse. God will give you a shepherd. There it is. Was it that verse? Okay, so it was the verse that Carter put up earlier. It was just a different translation. Jeremiah 3:15, in other translations, it says, "Then I will give you shepherds after my own heart." No, that is what he put. Maybe I was just reading it wrong. But God gives us shepherds. God is who assigns the shepherd in our life. So maybe I just read it quickly when I was reading that verse. All right. Carter asked, yeah, Amy said Jeremiah 3:15, what keeps coming up. I think I just read it quickly, or maybe I'm accustomed to reading it in a different translation, but I do think that's the right verse. Would a hired hand behavior be the sign of a false shepherd? I think so. I think that's probably the best way to articulate it. I'm trying to remember. I did a series on that last year. Let me see if I can pull up my notes. I do think I think a couple things. I'm trying to pull up those notes while I'm talking and thinking. All right. So I was looking at my notes to confirm what I'm about to say. So I did a sermon last year I actually did a series on false last year, beginning on Halloween and going through the month of November. So you can go back and watch that on any A-Hub streams, previous streams. When you study out the terms false in the Bible, there is false apostles, false prophets, and false teachers. There's really not a term that is used in the Bible for false shepherd. And I don't think false evangelist. I'd have to go back and look at all my notes on it, but I pulled up the ones on shepherd. Really, what the mentality of the enemy is if I can put in false upper levels of ministers. So apostles and prophets, both heavenly office. We'll get to this when we talk about the teacher, but the teacher is what office connects the apostles and prophets to the offices, the ministries of the shepherds and the evangelists. If the enemy can get what's taking place in the heavenlies under his control, he can utilize true officers in the kingdom of God and get them to function outside of their behavior and in ungodly manners and ways. So while the Bible doesn't specifically speak of a false shepherd, the equivalent of that would be a hired hand, somebody that's just there to do the functionality and not actually there to care for the sheep. So someone who would be there, as I mentioned, basically just there for a paycheck. They're not actually there because they desire to care for the sheep. So not necessarily the term false shepherd, but definitely the equivalent of how we would maybe consider a false person inside of that office to function. Amy said, I love the analogy of breaking the sheep's leg to draw closer to the shepherd. Sometimes we need to be broken to draw closer to our Father. Yeah. I mean, that's something that we typically don't think of, but that was a very common practice in shepherding communities, is that they would break the leg of the sheep, and then that shepherd would carry it over his neck, keeping it close to his heart until the leg healed, which may take quite some time, but it's so that the sheep gets close to hear and it recognizes the voice. It's constantly hearing the voice of the shepherd, but it remains close to the heartbeat. It can hear even the heart. What is the heart behind what the shepherd is doing? So we don't often think about that in modern times. But yeah, sometimes shepherds, sometimes even God will allow that brokenness to be a time for us to draw near to him. And sometimes that tough love from someone who holds maybe that pastoral grace, or we're giving better language, the office of a shepherd, sometimes they'll come in with some tough love and it may break us down, but it's so that we can be healed and have the heart to be healed, and also to not get out of alignment for what God desires for our life. So great thought, great feedback on that. All right, any other questions that you have for me today? I wanted to keep my time of teaching a little bit shorter and more concise. I really poured out a lot really quickly last week on profit, so I wanted to kind of have a little bit easier of a teaching to consume this week. So let me know any other thoughts or questions that you guys have in regards to shepherds or the term pastor, how this relates to other offices, maybe even sheep. Any other final questions? All right. I'm going to go ahead and get off of the live stream. If you guys don't have any other questions, I'm going to pray over you guys, bless you guys. And if any questions come in before we close out, then I'll answer those. So, Father, I thank you that you desire to lead your church as sheep. I thank you that you have grafted in both the Jews and the Gentiles into one sheepfold. And I thank you that this is our privilege and that the office of the shepherd is the one who grooms us in many ways to hear your voice, to be drawn to your heart, Father. And I thank you that you desire for this grace to lead strongly and prevalently within your church, Father. I thank you for us being given this privilege to challenge our current contextualization of this office, and that challenging our perceptions of this office allow us to be led in greater capacities in the way that you desire. Jesus, I pray for those who are shepherds. I thank you for those who are not just hired hands. I pray that you give them boldness to confront the ways and the attacks of the enemy that are coming against your sheep. Father, I pray for boldness in their lives in the name of Jesus. Amen. One last question from Carter. He said, how do you discern the chosen shepherd? I think it's going to depend in part to the context of the local church and how they are structured. So our local church, of course, we have myself and Natalie holding offices of apostle and prophet, many other prophets in our church, and we're there and we're active on a weekly basis. So it's going to be different than a church that is under an apostolic covering, but that church is led by a shepherd. I think there's a lot of consideration to that. You're going to look for those that have the heart of a shepherd, those that are willing to love the sheep. They're capable of feeding the sheep. They're capable of tending the sheep. They're capable of giving tough love to the sheep. And also those who, like David, have the experience in spiritual warfare to protect the sheep and won't run away from the battle that is at hand. So I think in regards to shepherds, a lot of what I mentioned are skill sets that are developed. But just like with the other offices, there's going to be a time of consecration and preparation before they step into those offices. So I'm looking, for me, I'm looking for those that have been through some battles, who've confronted wolves, bears, lions, whatever, and they are prepared to be able to step in, and they know how to protect the sheep. And so we're looking another thing in regards to shepherds and the shepherd for that flock. Do they walk in the gift of healing? Do they know how to help people deal with soul trauma and healing from the past? Is their heart really geared toward healing the people and getting the people protected? We also understand not only are shepherds going to lead the 99 to go after the one, a shepherd's heart is going to be bringing the flock together. So while shepherds may lead from the back, one of the things that they do is their focus is on bringing the sheepfold together, keeping the people together. Shepherds smell like sheep, right? You've probably heard that said before, but their heart is drawing the people together. So they're really going to be confrontational against divisiveness. So those are some of the things that I look for in regards to shepherds. So feeding, tending, walking in the gift of healing, as well as understanding soul healing, soul trauma, and walking people through that, really having a heart for bringing the people together and taking them and leading them on the narrow pathway towards what God's promises is for them. So hopefully that kind of answered that question. All right. Thank you guys for being on with me on this week. We talked quite heavily about pastors. Is that term the best term to utilize to convey that office? Shepherd definitely gives us a better image of what that responsibility of that office is. And our current context and culture has kind of shifted what a pastor means and looks like. So definitely kudos to the ESV, the translators, for being bold and stepping out and saying, hey, we've got to shift our language back to a biblical and better understanding. So I enjoyed addressing this. Definitely jump on next week We'll be talking about the final two offices over the next 2 weeks. We'll be talking about teachers and evangelists. So thanks for being on. I'll see you guys next week as we continue discussing fivefold ministries and the fivefold officers. I love you, and I love this community, the More Than a Church podcast. I'll see you guys next week.